Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SFL webinar series. My name is Kelly Jemison, and I'm Students for Liberty's Program Manager. We are honored tonight to have Will Rinehart deliver a talk on Cyberlibertarianism and the future of the Internet. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the webinar series. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed 4 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students, other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on running a student organization, tabling hits, leadership training, an academic journal for liberty and society, and our bread and butter conferences. The SFL webinar series is our way of giving you access to the ideas of mentorship and liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week to put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. For a full list, please visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. Tonight's webinar is with Will Rinehart. Will Rinehart is a research fellow at Tech Freedom. For most of the last decade, he has been involved in print publications, beginning first as a reporter in the Illinois Media Company, and then moving to production management and advertising. Because of his skill set, he was asked to be the editor-in-chief of a small magazine in Central Illinois, which has helped to expand and migrate online. He was previously a Coke Fellow at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, concentrating on advertising policy and internet government. Prior to this, he was a research associate at the Illinois Policy Institute, where he studied state-level budget, energy, and tax issues. Rinehart has a bachelor's in political science from the University of Illinois, and is currently finishing his master's in new media communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Just know there will be about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions into the question box during the webinar. For those interested, this webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next few weeks. We will be sending you more detailed information about Students for Liberty and our upcoming webinars in the follow-up email. Without further ado, I present to you Will.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. So before I begin, I actually want to thank the Students for Liberty for having me speak today. I have been on the other side of a number of these webinars because they are very informative. So I was very pleased when I was asked to do it, and I hope you will learn as much today as I have in others. I also want to say from the beginning that this talk is heavily indebted to the work my colleagues Baron Soka and Adam Thier have done. They've written extensively on the subject of cyberlibertarianism. Theirs and others have been cited with links throughout this talk, and it's from my understanding that this PowerPoint will go out a little bit later. So first, a preview. Sorry, technical difficulties. Sorry about this. There we go. Sorry. Okay. So, first a preview. This is an outline of the things I'm going to cover today. First, I'm going to explore the cyberlibertarian framework, and here we're going to cover a good amount of material. For this audience in particular, you will notice that many of the things I'm going to cover tonight have their echoes in important scholars like Mises, Hayek, Coase, and Schumpeter. And in many cases, they are cited specifically. Being a cyberlibertarian means being versed in these thinkers first. And even though we are very much at the weeds, the policy at Tech Freedom, we make it a priority to situate ourselves within history and to look towards the larger picture. So after outlining a basic framework for understanding, I'm then going to discuss a little bit about SOPA and PIPA, which have made headlines recently. And then I'm going to explore two areas that are seeing the most discussion currently, which include privacy and antitrust. So, what is a cyberlibertarian? I would say that there have actually been two generations of cyberlibertarian. As the internet has matured, the kinds of concerns have shifted, resulting in different kinds of regulatory proposals, which has precipitated a different kind of response in policy and in scholarship. Even though the roots of the internet go back to the 1960s, it really wasn't until the 1980s and in the early 1990s that it began to take off. That's when, in the early 1980s, it began to become commercialized. As other businesses and entities got online, there began to be pushes for regulatory action. And this is where the first generations of cyber-libertarians came into being. They were concerned with one primary question, or at least to me it seems that they were concerned with one primary question, and that is the Internet a governable space? You know, in hindsight it may look like an odd question, but there's a lot of 90s optimism. Perhaps some of you are actually old enough to remember some of that optimism. The Internet was new and exciting then, and there was this hope imbued in it. We now call it Internet exceptionalism. And at its core, its adherents professed a belief that the Internet was not just an exceptional and unique place that held the possibility to change for better democracy, to change citizenship, to change social values. Authors like Esther Dyson and George Gilder, George Keyworth and Alan Toffler talked about change in sociability and the fierce independence that is being fostered on the Internet. David Post proclaimed infamously that traditional legal structures were not applicable to the Internet. But I would say that the tenor is best summed up by the words of John Perry Barlow, who said, "Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." You can hear the defiance and the resolve in the inflection of this quote. John Perry Barlow went on to create the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which continues to be an influential force in tech policy. But his proclamation went largely unheard. Just a couple of years later, the first pieces of legislation specifically written for the Internet had passed, and so passed questions about governance. This is where the current formulation of cyber-libertarian comes into being. At least this is where I think it comes into being, because it was reacting against a second wave of regulations. The most concise formulation comes from Baron Soka and Adam Thierer, two of my colleagues, whose I think is probably a good first approximation of what cyber-libertarians now believe. They said cyber-libertarianism refers to the belief that individuals acting in whatever capacity they choose as citizens, consumers, companies, or collectives should be at liberty to pursue their own interests and tastes online. Obviously, this is more than just an affirmative statement of liberty applied to cyberspace. What I think is particularly interesting about the Internet and communication technologies in general is that the space combines two of the primary themes of liberty, economic liberty and social liberty. And we talk a lot about this, you know. The Internet, however, is a nexus between these two. Social and cultural liberties of the individual, like free expression and free association, are woven together intimately and tightly with commercial and economic liberty. You know, Facebook as a business would not really exist, and again, it's a commercial and it's an expression of commercial and economic liberty. So Facebook wouldn't exist, though, if people didn't freely choose to express and associate with others online. Legislative proposals then have the effect of pitting these broad groups of liberties against each other. And then you add in all the other philosophical voices and the usual power brokers, and you have a constantly churning dynamic being played out on the legislative stage. So moving from this concise statement to something a little bit more broad, I would say that there are three major beliefs connecting cyber-libertarians, which are present implicitly or explicitly in nearly all their work. First and most importantly is an optimism for the future. It is clear that optimism, both for the future and for advances in technology, is not shared by all. I think there's a very real fear that this generation that's now in their teens and 20s will actually have great reservations about technology. The economic downturn has played a key role, and other social shifts have also kind of precipitated some of this change. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say, this generation is going to be the first that does worse than their parents? Despite just being flatly false in a number of ways, the sentiment is common. But in tech policy, it's also very common. And some recent book titles give it away. For example, Eli Perazer of MoveOn.org recently released The Filter Bubble, and the subtitle of it was What the Internet is Hiding from You, which is just great. It's amazing. Jonathan Zittrain, famously a well-known legal scholar, wrote a book called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. And Nicholas Carr wrote the book How Google is Making You Stupid that came from an Atlantic article with the same name. At its core, though, it's an old argument about technology. It's a worry about the future and what the future may hold. Going back to Greek antiquity, we see in Plato's dialogues a character lamenting how writing has destroyed mind. I just want you to think about this quote for a second. It says, what you have discovered is a recipe not for memory but for reminder. And it is no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only its semblance. You know, this is a great quote, And I think if it was made a little bit more colloquial, a little bit more modern, it would fit in any of these books that I just described. You know, just switch in Google for a second. This is something that is often expressed. What you have with Google is a recipe not for memory but for reminder, and it is no true wisdom that Google offers you, but only its semblance. While legislative proposals are different than years past and obviously different from Greek antiquity, by and large, the overriding issues are not really new. They're just new iterations, I think, of the same argument. And while we should be mindful about technological deployment, it actually comes down to a philosophical distinction that I think Virginia Postrel captured well when she said, how we feel about the evolving future tells us who we are as individuals in this civilization. Do we search for stasis, a regulated, engineered world, or do we embrace dynamism, a world of constant creation, discovery, competition? Do we value stability and control, or evolution and learning? Do we think that progress requires a central blueprint, or do we see it as a decentralized evolutionary process? Do we consider mistakes permanent disasters, or the correctable byproducts of experimentation? Do we crave predictability, or do we relish surprise? These two poles, stasis and dynamism, increasingly define our political, intellectual, and cultural landscape. The central question of our time is what to do about the future, and that question creates a deep divide. And I would say that is the question. So those who are cyber-libertarians, rather, are clearly on the side of dynamism. And I think this comes from predisposition to the power and really appreciation of the market. And this is probably the second major tenet of cyber-libertarianism, I would say. But the market here is not the Dow Jones Industrial Average, but I hope, especially with this audience, this is not what we think about when we think about the market. The market is the dynamic and evolutionary process that Mises and Hayek talked about. However, I'm actually most fond of Kerzner's formulation, who recognized the importance of the entrepreneur to innovation and made the strong case, quite correctly, that every human action is an entrepreneurial action. As he pointed out, each action has infused within it alertness to possibly new worthwhile goals and to possibly new available resources. This is what's happening to the net. Each app is a test and a testament to the entrepreneurial alertness of the developers. Each new web service and platform that goes onto the net is an expression of what those people think is needed. It is all very much an entrepreneurial process. You know, I would point out that the iPhone, where we get the term app from, was actually introduced in 2007. The App Store, that was opened in July of 2008. We haven't even really seen 4 years of this technology. And yet, as I will talk a little bit about later, there are already demands for regulatory response. So in addition to economics, technology, and policy, one of my interests is persuasion, and especially rhetoric, especially how we understand and argue policy and economics. So a couple of years back, I conducted an empirical study that compared cyber-libertarians to others. And by far the most significant difference in the arguments is the continual reliance on competition and the competitive process, common stand-ins for these complex dynamics that we call the market. This is in contradistinction to others because, unfortunately, economic literacy is fairly widespread. Professor Bill Goff found that misconceptions among his economics students are actually quite common. When asked how much income per person in the U.S. has changed since 1950, the median student responded with an increase of 25%. The actual rate was around 250%. So the median student was off by a factor of 10. And this was actually pretty common. Students similarly miscalculated by factors in guessing the average profit ratio, the percentage of people earning a minimum wage, and the overall inflation rates. Now, if you built a bridge and were wrong by these amounts, people would literally die. This is not meant to be hyperbolic. These numbers are not just miscalculations. They speak to many people's predisposition of markets, and also they speak to how they feel about the future and the past. And these are the kinds of results that we get from economics students because Bill Goff actually surveyed his economics students in doing these surveys. And we would assume that economics students have some sort of predisposition or some sort of appreciation towards the market. So in policy, there's actually in tech policy rather, there are actually a number of think tanks who actually don't have economists or people with economic degrees on staff. It's unfortunately a feature of the political landscape that we must work within. But that makes the good news story all that much more difficult to tell. So Professor Brian Kaplan has noted that 4 major biases are pretty common for the general public in regards to economics. The last two of these are the most important. There's the anti-market bias, which is the tendency to underestimate the economic benefits of the market mechanism. And then the pessimistic bias, the tendency to overestimate the severity of economic problems and underestimate the past, present, and future performance of the economy. Again, if you see optimism as being one of these key characteristics of cyberlibertarianism, especially the last issue, the pessimistic bias, is actually very, very important. As economic historian Joel Moyker said of this, he said, if there's a lesson to be learned from the history of technology, and of course this is really what I'm talking about, it's that Schumpeterian growth, like other forms of economic growth, cannot and should not be taken for granted. Schumpeter is another intellectual heavyweight here who made the idea of creative destruction. But he was in some key regards pessimistic about the long-term prospects of capitalism because he worried that people would forget about the engine of growth. You know, in Joel Moyker's parlance, the labor of riches, which is the name of his book. And we too actually consistently worry about the unintended consequences of policy, especially if it has the effect of altering preferences, distorting prices, and changing markets. Technological progress actually is in fact highly sensitive to the social and economic environment and can be arrested by relatively small external changes. So like other technology, the internet has within it liberating qualities that lead not just to the demolishing of certain material needs, but also the opening up of new possibilities. However, of course, this does not come freely because the change creates all sorts of types of change that you would actually expect in society and wealth and in prestige and influence. All of these butt up against the eternal source of power, namely the government. And this is the last major characteristic of cyber-libertarians. It is by far the most obvious threat here, and it's obviously where the name comes from, which is that there are always very real consequences with government meddling. So leaving out some of the most egregious examples in housing, agriculture, and trade, and I'm sure other professors and other people through these webinars have actually talked about many of these issues, the history of telecommunications policy is relatively long-lived and sordid. So the beginning of the story that I would say that began, or rather the beginning of the story that we tell in telecom starts in 1913 when AT&T signed what's called the Kingsbury Agreement with the Justice Department. It established the company as a government-sanctioned monopoly. And interestingly enough, the agreement came after an antitrust case was brought against the company. They were worried that Google was becoming a monopoly, so they made them a monopoly. It's a sort of higher-order logic that I really cannot understand. But in return, AT&T voluntarily submitted to the whims of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Thus began an empire that rose over the course of 70 years to become the behemoth that was slain in the 1980s. So, even though the Depression had ended by the 1940s, the regulatory mood favored the business model of AT&T. You had scientism, the government working with business to develop had taken over. And this intimate connection between government and business really had been created this time. And so many looked over to AT&T and saw a very workable model. And so it was co-opted for a number of industries, rather. When the 80s eventually came around and deregulation began, we ended up reforming many of the network industries, including telecom and trucking, shipping, and electricity. But the point here is not about just better means of governance, but it's about the failure of regulation. There's a naivete even now about government that comes when public choice theory is not embraced. And this is one of the key points of the literature, is that the government works not for ideological reasons, but for institutional reasons. It's simply not just the case after all these years that we could start creating better policies if only we had better policies to implement. One of the most influential voices on the subject, Tim Wu, spoke extensively in his book, The Master Switch, about regulatory capture in telecom. But then, after it all, he called for a separations principle between all the players. This would separate government and content providers like MTV and CNN. It would separate the hardware providers from the backbone providers, so it would separate Comcast from NBC. And it would separate government from everyone, Missing, of course, the economic argument generally that there are some benefits to vertical integration and obviously double marginalization problems, etc., etc. He said of this, government may function as a check on abuse of power, but government itself is a power that must be checked. And this was all wrapped up within his belief of the separations principle. But, and this is a very, very common idea, but what exactly is an abuse of power here? It's such an amorphous concept as to nearly lose its meaning. People often talk about the cost of their phone bills as being an abuse of companies' power, but Americans are often the biggest users of phones, and it's again the same with cable and internet. Now, if we're talking about media diversity, which is what he groups in here, woo that is, then the history is clearly not on his side. For many years, the television industry was actually able to fend off the cable industry through regulations. The Fairness Doctrine, which was implemented by the FCC rather in the late 40s, was designed to create more opportunities to discuss conflicting point of views of very, very big public importance. But when they repealed it some 40 years later in '87, if I recall correctly, the FCC said outright that the net effect of the legislation was that there was a reduction rather than an enhancement of discussion of controversial issues of public importance. Unintended consequences because of government regulation are repeated over and over again in telecom. And it is for this reason that we agree with Justice Kennedy, who said, I mean for us at least famously, there we go, that technology expands the capacity to choose, and it denies the potential of this revolution if we assume the government is best positioned to make these choices for us. So how does this play out in policy? Well, first off, let's have a couple words about SOPA and PIPA, which seem to really... Now, there are a couple of issues with this bill that were especially troublesome. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it because it's actually a fairly complex issue. But just as a refresher, both of these bills were basic attempts to stop infringing content, or at least to stem the tide online. There were attempts to basically deal with copyright by changing certain features of the internet that would allow content owners to go after people who had infringed on content. So this would be like NBC, this would be like Time Warner, they'd be the content providers, the people who provide television shows, radio shows, etc., etc. Now, beyond the issues within the bill, there are actually some major issues with the proceedings themselves. SOPA had only one hearing, and there was not a single person at the hearing who could speak on the technical aspects of the bill. And, you know, in a similar way, this is a problem that's actually faced by many people, by many agencies, rather. They have attorneys, but they don't have technologists. They have people who know the law and what can be done with the law, but they do not have people who can weigh in on the technical capabilities. They don't have people who can speak on the feasibilities of law. And so you often see these laws which are quite, you could say interesting, they're quite onerous. But I'm going to be honest here, you know, we cannot expect from the government that it will refrain from creating legislation. Its purpose is to make laws. What we can hope for and what we can work for and what I am working for is to make sure that the laws are not, again, overtly onerous. And this is what was so disconcerting about SOPA. Probably the most contentious part of SOPA was what was called the domain name system filtering provision. Now the easiest way to think about this, now this is the domain name system, and this is actually kind of an important part of the internet. So think about this like a phone book. If you want to call someone but you don't know the number, you're going to have to look it up on a phone book. The same is true with the internet. Each website has a domain name like Google, but there is also a number called the IP address, which is actually used to communicate with the website. So when you type google.com into your browser, your computer actually contacts another computer, this domain name system, the DNS computer, which then acts like a phone book and sends back to you the IP number for the specific domain name. Only then can your computer communicate with the desired website. Now, if you want to see this in action, I would actually suggest going to this. This is Google's homepage, and this is actually the real place where Google resides online. I mean, Google has many addresses online. But this is probably the most common. And if you were to click on here, if you were actually to type in 74.125.224.72, it would take you directly to Google's homepage. So the DNS is foundational, and arguably the Internet was created when the DNS was implemented in 1983. And if you remember from a little bit earlier in the talk, I had suggested exactly this thing, that in fact when the commercialization really kind of grew at this point, the DNS system really is the point of commercialization. It allows us to easily access these websites. I mean, think about typing this into your computer all the time instead of typing it in Google. So what the system creates is this shared space. It's called a namespace, and it allows various sites and computers to talk with one another. But unfortunately, it was never really meant to be safe, which is exactly what researchers are now working on their own and with companies. What SOPA and PIPA would have done, and specifically SOPA, is that it would have nullified many of the current developments in security that are actually trying to make this system better. There are now undergoing, and this has been a 10-year process, a process to actually make this security better. So the problem is that attempts to engineer a kind of outcome through legislation often have detrimental effects, as we've seen earlier. And about half of all breaches in security are caused by what are called authentication errors. And what this difficult efforts that are currently underway, and again have been to combat this. So this law really would have been actually quite detrimental to issues in cybersecurity. So now what it was trying to combat is copyright. And I think we obviously need to have a discussion, a larger discussion about copyright. But it needs to be a measured one. We shouldn't rush into it without first discussing the proposed solutions to some of the most important stakeholders, especially those who are actively working with companies and organizations on their own to make key parts of the Internet more secure. This would have greatly diminished security. And regardless of your view on copyright, if either you want to abolish it or extend it, most can agree that content industries have to innovate and expand into new industries. This will ultimately be the solution that SOPA and PIPA were trying to address. And we're seeing this, it's occurring. And this again is where the dynamic market comes into play. You know, there's not just Netflix. Xfinity has gotten into streaming content. Apple looks to be expanding into this space. You have the iStore, you have Spotify, you have Pandora. These are all small solutions to the problem that SOPA and PIPA were trying to address. Each of these, Spotify, iStore, Pandora. But what we have to think about are not solutions in the singular sense, but solutions in the plural sense. A big area that we work on pretty consistently is privacy, which is a fairly contentious term. There's no real consensus on what it means, because in the legal context, it's a little bit hazy. The original formulation comes from a famous article by Warren and Brandeis, who would eventually go on to become Supreme Court justices. And in their article, A Right to Privacy, they wrote that recent inventions and business methods call attention to the right to be left alone. Instantaneous photographs and newspaper enterprise have invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life, and numerous mechanical devices threaten to make good the prediction, or rather the prediction that what is whispered in the closet shall be proclaimed from the housetops. This is actually a very famous phrase. But it's not exactly clear what the right to be left alone would look like on privacy. And indeed, much of the work being conducted on privacy is a reconceptualization being applied to the Internet. This is part of the problem. Numerous scholars have pointed out that there's actually a pretty solid incoherence to the right to privacy. You know, is it a positive right? Is it something you have a right to? Is it a negative right in the sense of the Constitution? Or is it a right or a prohibition in the sense of the Constitution? So I am actually very skeptical of privacy as a right. But recently, the President posted what is being called now the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights in order to try to create this. As my colleagues Baron Soka and Larry Downs wrote in response, this report begins and ends the constitutional sleight of hand. President Obama starts reminding us of the Fourth Amendment's essential protection, which is the unlawful intrusion into our homes in personal papers by government, but then the report recommends no reform whatsoever for outdated laws that have actually facilitated a dangerous expansion of electronic surveillance. This is the true threat to our privacy. The report, again, the President's report, dismisses it in the footnote. So what they were referring to here is what's called ECPA. And I'm sorry if I'm giving you a lot of different information, but if you have any clarifications, I will have my contact up later. So please do not hesitate to contact me. But anyway, what he was referring to is ECPA, the Electronic Communication Privacy Act, which sets restrictions on government collection of private data for its own use in investigations. Even among scholars, this piece of legislation is extremely arcane and actually pretty difficult to understand. So, for example, let's talk about email. So when you send an email, there are more than a few standards that the authorities have to follow if they're going to legally obtain the contents of your email. If it's saved on your computer, it's a different legal standard than if it's saved on Google servers. So a draft written in Microsoft Word is treated completely different than if it is written and saved in a draft on Google. Once you send it and it's going over the wires, the protections change. And then on the other side, before the recipient opens the email, it is yet another set of rules. And when they open up the email itself, again, it changes. And then once it sits in the inbox for 180 days, there's another standard that's applied. It is confusing. And there are other areas that are very similar, like GPS. In all, there is a great amount of legal uncertainty, which, as some have pointed out, leads to companies giving more information than they might otherwise. So it is not clear exactly how much data the government is going after and for what kinds of investigations, but we know the lower bound is probably in the tens of thousands, as Verizon is apparently giving the government, and the upper bound is probably going to be in the millions, which is apparently the amount of information that Sprint has given the government. Going back to the President's report, many calls for extensive new regulation of the Internet businesses in the name of privacy seem at first glance a little parental, and I think they really are. You know, do as I say, not as I do. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it becomes apparent that if the President were actually to suggest these laws that protect privacy outright, which is not exactly what he's doing, he's actually looking for more of a stakeholder initiative, and he wants the industry itself to take on these rights. Now, if this were actually to become a legislation, and not what he's proposing, then there would be actually some very serious First Amendment issues to sort out. Professor Eugene Volokh said it best, that the right to information privacy, my right to control your information of personally identifiable information about me, is a right to have the government stop you from speaking about me. This is clearly the rub of rights that I was talking about earlier between the social rights, the rights of free association, of free speech, the individual social rights that one has, and the economic rights. And it really strikes at the heart of the issues of privacy. Proposals for information privacy that they want to implement use, you know, it's a good idea because, at least the argument is a good idea because, you know, why not? Why shouldn't a business be able to communicate information about clients without clients' permission? But again, going back to Volokh, the difficulty is in the information privacy is really in the companies, or rather the governments, saying to the companies that you have to stop speaking about other people. So there's even more to this. Many who push for privacy rules have privacy as their first-order ethical consideration. You could call them privacy fundamentalists. And funny enough, when Google's actually introduced, one group called EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, actually called for an investigation. And that's actually, you can still actually go onto their website and look for this. It's kind of funny because it's kind of become, Gmail is a great service. But to take another recent example, there was quite a stir when Google changed their privacy policy. Originally, the change was really intended to allow them to use the data that they had across various services to provide a more integrated and seamless experience for the user. They were trying to move towards a model like Twitter and Facebook, which is an integrated platform. Both of the other companies started out that way, but Google itself has had to move that way. And many have cried foul over this change, but there is really little intellectual weight behind the criticism. Jeff Chester was quoted in the Washington Post saying that there's no way a user could comprehend the implications of Google collecting information across platforms about your health, political opinions, and financial concerns. But interestingly enough, as Google noted in their press release, and it is very evident if you actually look through the policy change itself, they're not actually collecting any more information than they did, nor are they selling the information in new ways. And it really is what's happening is that they are simply combining all the information into one profile, where previously they had many separate profiles. Users are still anonymized into ad groups, and all of the protective measures still exist before. And the other thing to say about this is that, if you don't like Google, if you don't like the fact that they have your data, you can get your data taken out. All you have to do is go to the data liberation front, and there are methods to get your data out if you feel that's something that needs to be done. Online privacy is obviously in a state of flux. Social networking technologies are rapidly changing, but some of the greatest pushback have been to features that eventually have become cherished aspects of the social media experience. I remember Facebook when it was actually the Facebook, and when it expanded to high school students, there was a huge pushback. With the addition of the feed, again, there was a huge pushback. When the feed was limited, and when the site was opened up to the general public, again, fears about privacy were extensive. However, there are still controls. There are still fallbacks with the U.S. government, and there's still possible enforcement action. But above all, I think what we need to remember is that there's an intense dynamism and innovative process occurring. Think back to Kerzner, like I mentioned before, and his view of individual entrepreneurship. Each action, he said, had within it an alertness to possibly new worthwhile goals and to possibly new available resources. We need not to limit this talk of innovation and entrepreneurship to corporations, but we need to expand it to include users and to people who are online. There are lots of people right now who are working to expose technical failures. There are also a lot of people who are working on what's called the reputational market. They work consistently because they are, as expressed before, privacy fundamentalists. For all the problems, what they do provide is a feedback mechanism. They show what potentially are the most egregious errors by Facebook and by Google and by all of these large media companies who are online. And what they do is they provide a market that's reputational in this sense. The Wall Street Journal, for example, has an ongoing series called What You Know that's very much in this similar kind of vein. They're exposing what's actually going on online to tell people such that people start demanding it. Then also you have what's called social steganography, which is the ability of users to actually achieve a certain set of privacy by hiding the meaning of their words in plain sight. Dana Boyd has actually done some extensive work on this, and it's actually very, very interesting. We also know that users, and this came out very recently through a Pew poll, that users actually use privacy features very commonly. They use it very often. We know that they call users from their lists. We know that they use privacy settings and other techniques. We know, for example, also that there's identity obfuscation, and identity obfuscation is basically using techniques to mask yourself over number of sites. So, for example, you would use your Facebook profile, and it would only be open in, say, Chrome or Firefox, whereas all of your other web surfing would go on in Internet Explorer, and that way all the cookies, all the information that's being collected about you are totally separate into two separate areas, two separate web browsers. This is what's called identity obfuscation. So this is another way that people are dealing with this, and that people are actually experiencing this. And as Facebook began to talk about facial recognition software, you also had a different response, which is very interesting, I think. You had test patterns for these new makeups actually go on, and you had this expansion and this kind of expansion of new hairdos, which is actually very interesting because it actually does look very futuristic. The point I'm trying to make is that a one-size-fits-all approach will not be beneficial, nor do I think that we should ask for one, because people continually want different things with their experiences online. And this is not what we're getting right now, and nor should it, this is what we are getting right now, and it's what we should get continually. Again, I would just say that a one-size-fits-all approach is just not beneficial. So now the last area that I'm talking about, which is antitrust. And again, There's connections here to dynamism. Whereas privacy activists want to create a static set of preferences for privacy, antitrust has been looking to do the same in telecom infrastructure and search. Now, Tech Freedom has written extensively on the subject of infrastructure and antitrust laws, or rather antitrust issues. But for everyone today, I'm just going to really focus on search. And for those that do not know, Google is currently facing antitrust scrutiny. There's an open investigation both here in the States and across the pond that will probably come out on sometime the next year or early next year based on Google's search practices. The public face of this is actually kicked off late last year when there were proceedings on the Hill. Then Google CEO Eric Schmidt was asked to go before the Senate, and in a particularly interesting session, he was actually made to atone for his company's sins, so to say. There were very one-sided hearings, and instead of actually looking at the entire search landscape, they looked to competitors. And what the competitors saw, obviously, was a fiercely competitive company. And so, most logically, this isn't logical action, they got in line and acted as advocates against the search giant. But if people would have really taken the time to look back at the issues, they would have seen a couple of interesting people talking about this. Another competitor, Blacko, the president actually had a blog post that was very interesting about this subject. And Blacko, their entire business model is run on the fact that they aren't Google and they actually provide a better search query. And they've been doing pretty well in the last 2 years. They've been getting a lot of good funding, and the amount of searches that they're serving has been going up pretty precipitously. What he said, this is Rich Strenka. Never can pronounce that. We don't need a federal intervention to level the playing field with Google. Innovation and competition are far more powerful instruments, which has been more detrimental to Microsoft's business. The lawsuit brought by the Department of Justice in the 1990s, or the innovative products that that Apple has brought to the marketplace. The success of Google should be applauded on Capitol Hill, not derided. Let's let entrepreneurs, technology, and good old-fashioned innovation deal with Google. Consumers will always be the winners in that scenario. And he's obviously very correct about this. Then you also have researchers on the other side, like Nova Spivak, who's an optimist about technology, but not so much about Google. He said, Google is really much more important when the web was in millions of pages. Now we're entering a web that's going to be billions. Well, it already is. And soon it's going to be trillions. And Google does not scale to that. Spivak and others wonder about the long-term viability of keyword search. And from a technical standpoint, it's actually a very good and a very good open question. Search satiates the need for information. And to the extent that they are able to serve up relevant results, Google will continue to draw an audience, though preferences can swiftly change. In the long run, Google was able to lure users from other search engines to steadily gather steam, putting them in the position that they are today. But just as quickly, they lost this lead when a glitch showed every link as spam back in 2009. Users responded quickly by moving over to other search sites. And this is to say that this cost of switching search engines is really minimum, and that it actually undercuts many of the arguments and the reasoning for antitrust. Now, I actually want to talk a little bit about this because there are other changes that actually loom large at the edge of the technological periphery. Siri could change expectations with search, even though there's not anything particularly new about the program. You have a voice recognition software that deciphers speech, which is then checked against a large store of stock commands and internet access to give a sense about AI. Now, obviously, Siri can't answer a variety of questions, but the expectations of AI have placed pressure on a number of search providers to develop more complex and capable search methods. Again, this is the market in action. And responding, Google fellow Amit Singhal explained that Google was actually undertaking a project to do this by developing a large in-house understanding of what an entity is and to make a repository of entities in the world. Basically, what they're trying to do is mimic key features of human rationality and implement this into search, which would give a complex and an interesting new level to search. They predict that it would be a radical shift for it. But regardless, Google's value to the internet has not just been their relevance in the search results realm, but also in their ability to do cheaply. So on the programming end, they have a program that's called MapReduced, and it has been key to Google's development, allowing the company to scale up as their computing operations have scattered across multiple data centers. You know, programming is a fairly arcane part of this discussion, and it really doesn't occur that often, but it actually serves as an important connection because key players on the internet like Google, Amazon, and Facebook each have been able to scale up on the back end because of their own proprietary software that they've developed and that they've spent a lot of time and energy developing. It's a fairly difficult and costly thing to accomplish, but it's incredibly important in providing good service and to, again, scaling up cheaply. Coupled with cheap hardware, Google was able to expand its infrastructure as the web exploded in the 2000s. So really, Google has been innovating on a number of fronts, and I'm not really sure what a cadre of regulators could actually do very well that paid search engineers and technical engineers couldn't do. Again, all this assumes that search needs to be regulated and that there's a problem on the face of it. And of course, we don't know really what the antitrust suit is going to allege, but in the long run, as Bleco's president said, the market is going to serve as a check. You know, in these times, these dark times of antitrust, I am reminded, and I fall back on Ronald Coase, who said that contemplation of an optimal system may provide techniques of analysis that would otherwise have gone missed, and in certain cases, it may go far into providing a solution. But in general, its influence has been pernicious. It has directed economists' attention away from the main question, and this is very, very key, the main question, which is how alternative arrangements will actually work in practice. It has led economists to derive conclusions for economic policy from a study of an abstract market situation. It is no accident that in the literature we find a category market failure, but no category government failure. Until we realize that we're all choosing between social arrangements which are more or less failures, we're not really going to make much headway. With every economically free order, there's always going to be an outcome that makes people unhappy, especially if you're a direct competitor. But this is not the same as saying that another world is possible. However, if we do take a pessimistic view of the world, then perhaps action is needed. But I think this really misses the major bright spots in the economy. The Googles, the Facebooks, and the Amazons, they really are the best places for innovation and growth currently. And I think here we need to have a higher threshold, but I don't think that this should apply to Google, Facebook, and Amazon, because I think this threshold should generally be higher among regulatory regimes. Market failure is not demonstrated, or at least market failure should not be demonstrated unless a specific policy recommendation can be shown in which the benefits exceed the costs, including all of the administrative costs of policy. Claims of market imperfections that cannot be established upon a theoretical possibility of improved allocation, but require feasible alternatives for a particular case. Again, one that takes into account all the relevant costs. And to apply this to search in the web, we have to really say that, you know, the market is going to change pretty dramatically in the next 6 to 8 months. And, you know, even now with traditional analysis of antitrust analysis, rather, it's pretty difficult to say what's going to happen. Eventually, though, and ultimately, really, I'm optimistic because what we're going to see, and what I know we're going to see, is better information, better quality, and really what we're going to see is it gets better. This is, of course, if we don't do things to really mess up the internet. Now, to end this discussion, I want to go back to a couple of the authors I mentioned earlier in my talk, Esther Dyson, George Gilder, George Keyworth, and Alan Toffler, because they have a quote that strikes me, and so I've adapted it to use without all the catchphrases. They said, living rather on the leading edge of revolutionary change, we're all witnessing a battle not so much for the nature of the future, it will arrive, but over the nature of the transition. Cyberlibertarianism, at least the kind of I have espoused today, I think is a philosophy that will best guide this transition. And what we need is to be optimistic about that future, about its possibilities, because I really think that it is only the especially we need to be optimistic about this future because it is only really through individual actions and not government fiat that will see an optimistic and a better world actually come true. So that really ends it. I would also say that if you want to contact me, this, as you will now see, is my contact information. Check me out on Twitter, _Rinehart. If you have any questions, I'm kind of busy a little bit this week, but I will try to get back to you as soon as I can if you were to send me an email at wrinehart@techfreedom.org. And please check out our material. It's at techfreedom.org, facebook.com/techfreedom, and again the hashtag @_ tech_freedom. So with that, I think I will start getting to some questions.
Thank you, Will, so much for the presentation. A reminder to everyone, please type in your questions in the question box on the webinar screen here, and we'll be more than happy to get to your questions here. So we've got our first question already. Samuel Konkin talks about the possibility of technology outflanking the state and helping to expand freedom in society. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm sorry, what was that name specifically?
Samuel Konkin?
Daniel Konkin. Can't say that I've actually heard of that person. I mean, as far as creating it's interesting because the talk about creating an order outside of the state was really kind of the initial ones that the internet exceptionalists were talking about. This is kind of an interesting feature because what I think you're going to see is really what are called localized orders. So you'll see like places, for example, in Wikipedia has its own kind of rational order, or rather spontaneous order, and Reddit has its own kind of spontaneous order. I don't think you're going to see anything happen for the internet as a whole because the internet by its very nature is a very fractured and, again, a very fractured and localized network of networks. So in this regard, I'm optimistic because I think what the internet provides is obviously with this, diminished transaction costs, that really what the internet provides is people to talk and converse and to do much better than they are currently doing. But at the end of the day, there are still, physical goods that need to be exchanged, and people still generally live obviously people still live in physical bodies. So yeah, I don't know if that completely answers the question, but I think it's going to be much more localized, and what we've really been seeing is much more localized structures. There's actually a really good article about this. I can't remember the name of the author, but the name of the paper is called Wiki Law through Wiki Order, something along those lines. And he basically talks a lot about how actually structures of an institution are very important in kind of creating these localized orders. So there's obviously a really complex story going on here. Yeah, I'll just keep it at that. So yes.
Great. Next question. This is similar to what you were saying about Google's privacy issues. But what do you think about Facebook's privacy and the ways that people overreact whenever Facebook changes something in their policy?
I mean, the reaction I think is a natural reaction because whenever there's a changeover from the new to the old, there's obviously going to be a reaction. But as I would say, some of the kind of the most cherished features of Facebook have been the things that have often gotten very huge pushback. There was a a Facebook group in the hundreds of thousands, if I recall, pushing back against the feed, which is now kind of like the key feature of Facebook. And I would actually be very interested to see who the same people were if they were the same people who then later joined another Facebook group that were pushing back against the feed once it got limited to the people that you tend to go on the profiles of pretty often. I don't know if you know this, but Facebook now, it has it's part of the subscribed list on the side, and you can unsubscribe from people that you don't want to have in your feed. In general, there are a lot of ways to deal with privacy, and that's really what I would get down to, and that's really what I say is kind of the that's kind of the good news story with Facebook. In talking with people who are at Facebook, it's kind of an interesting situation because in order to do kind of new and innovative things, they often have to push the bounds of what they feel is currently acceptable within, currently acceptable for privacy. But at the end of the day, I don't really know what the harms would be. I'm really kind of at a loss for what kinds of harms that one would actually experience. I mean, you've heard these instances of people who have gotten in trouble with work, or have not gotten potentially not gotten jobs because of Facebook. But people use privacy settings pretty extensively, and I think that's really what we need to go to. You need to have people think about what their reputation is. I mean, because this is an online space, it is something that is reflective of you, it is representational of you, and I think we need to. I mean, part of this probably would be at younger, at younger ages. Having some type of media literacy program such that people will understand the implications of what's going on online. But again, this is much more in the lines of information and education and more opportunities, and maybe asking, Facebook, or helping Facebook along the lines of creating new opportunities for their own privacy settings. I don't necessarily think that the best options would come through regulations. This is kind of taking the top, it's kind of going off a little bit off topic, but I think that generally, I think people are a little bit, obviously they worry about their privacy because there's something to it. It's an expectation. There's an expectation to privacy, but again, I'm a little hesitant, and I try to take a little bit more of a measured approach to this. That being said, I mean, I do have privacy settings pretty high on my Facebook wall, so I don't know if that is also meaningful. Perhaps, may not. Any else?
Okay. Yep. How concerned should libertarians be about government aggregating information from social media websites, web searches, GPS tracking, etc., towards tracking citizens for the purpose of domestic surveillance? Should we be fearful of information sharing for this reason? Is there a need for explicit legal restraints against government in the forms of legislation?
Yes, and we are very much a part of this. It's called ECPA. Again, I mentioned a little bit in my talk. It's called ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. We're looking actually to work with a broad-based coalition of people to reform this, and actually to restrict government's use, and to restrict government's use of information. Now, there's two sides to this. There's obviously, we need to make sure that there are, and if you check out ECPA reform and what's called the Digital Due Process Coalition, there's actually a lot of work being done on this. Should we be fearful? I think it's probably a good question. Should we be fearful of sharing information such that the government might be able to get it? The government is, I mean, if it really, really wanted to get certain kinds of information, I guess it could. There are obviously a lot of problems. There are a lot of problems with. There's a lot of problems with this, and let me step back and talk about it like this. There was actually a recent article that came out talking about Facebook. I believe it was Facebook. One of the people at Facebook had told actually this reporter, Kashmir Hill, who, if anyone is really interested in privacy issues, she's by far the best person really to look at this. She's on Forbes. She has a blog. It's called The So-Called Private Parts. And basically, in one of her articles, she kind of was recounting a story that she had with a person over at Facebook, and basically, this person at Facebook had told her that one of the agencies, I believe it was one of the enforcement agencies, actually came to Facebook and told them that you guys need to be collecting more information, or rather, it would be a good thing if you're collecting more information. So I think part of this obviously is we need some kind of, we obviously need, yes, we need reform in this regard. And it's also kind of unclear where the lines lay. So yes, we need to be reformed. We need to have reform. I don't know how much. Government's pretty inept, so I don't know how fearful you should be about the government actually using this excessively detrimentally. I mean, there's obviously cases that are pretty important. You know, national security letters. That's a whole different topic to discuss. Yeah, I don't know how fearful you should be. I mean, I wouldn't get paranoid over it, but I mean, it's something that obviously needs to be done. There are obviously issues, and the law really needs to be cleaned up. Is what I would say on that.
Can you talk more about data liberation or libertarian front? What is this for Facebook, Google, etc.? What are the rules regarding having your user information removed from their system?
Yeah, the data liberation front is that's specific to Google. Facebook does not actually have anything that's very similar to that. And basically, you can get the information pulled from their sites. You have to go through it. It shows you how to do it. I mean, it takes a little while. The information, part of that also, the ease of all of this, and from my understanding, they're going to probably, I'm fairly sure from what I've heard is that they're actually going to revamp some of this to make it easier to pull your information out. But basically, you can pull out your information. There are certain parts of Google that you can go in. It's under you know, under your user settings that you ask specifically not to be tracked through various details. Really, what I'm talking about here are the methods that consumers have and users have of this, of these sites rather. Specifically Google and Facebook. There's also some resources on Facebook if you check out. There are Firefox add-ons, etc., that will stop this blocking if this is an issue that you think it needs to be solved. I would say though on the other end that, you know, Facebook and Google, they're not running free sites, and really what they are doing is they're trying to provide the best service that they can. So in this regard, I'm not really too worried about advertisements, because I mean this is all really what it's coming down to, is that what Facebook and Google are doing is that they're also on the, you know, so Facebook and Google have back-end interfaces, and you can actually access these through their paid search vehicles and their webmaster services, etc., etc. And what they're basically doing is they're giving, through their own programs, they're giving advertisers the ability to target certain individuals that they think would be good for their businesses. But you're not getting actual personal information, so in this sense, there is actually still a level of separation between the user and the advertiser who is advertising to that person. They really don't know who they're advertising to. They're aggregating preferences, they're anonymizing this data, or rather, they're anonymizing these groups, and then the advertiser is then able to advertise to those groups. So there is a certain level of protection. It's not like advertisers know, oh, Will Rinehart likes blah 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 blah. We're going to advertise specifically to him. What in fact is happening is that I'm getting put into a pool of people, you know, male, 25 to 35, who generally likes, you know, this kind of music, and who generally likes, you know, these types of movies and television shows, and I'm getting advertised specifically for these things. So that's the back end. If you're interested, there's a whole bunch of services that do this. Check out, let's see, I would check out actually some of Chris Sigorian's work. He has been pretty influential in this space. He's a pretty interesting character. I would also say check out, you know, AdBlocker if you're interested in this. Check out and go to Facebook, or go to Facebook. I mean, rather go to Google and check out their ad collection services. You can change around things. These are all options that you can have to make sure that if you are worried about your privacy, that you can get them. You know, you can get a higher level of protection that you would that you do have. You do have other higher levels of protection if you feel like this is an issue.
And we have one last question here.
Yeah.
Telecommunications can be used to promote peaceful revolutions, like in the Arab Spring, but it can also be used via expanded surveillance, or when companies turn over data to governments, to oppress the populace. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the advancements in internet technology for human freedom in general?
It's actually a really good. It's actually a very good question to end on. I'm extremely optimistic. There is a certain ethos that we try to cultivate within tech freedom, which is the kind of the hacker ethic, which is very much that you don't. The good thing about the internet. Let me start here. The good thing about the you generally knew the underlying structures obviously very, very well. And it's still very much a lot of the people who are working in privacy, a lot of the people who are working in, on security research, they know what's going on. And I guess the question really boils down to what do you think? Are you optimistic about the world? Are you optimistic about people? Are you optimistic about freedom? Or are you pessimistic about the world? Are you pessimistic about freedom? And I am the eternal optimist. I think that we have more and more tools, and people are very, very smart. People are going to use these tools in new and innovative ways that, unfortunately, even the best paid engineer is not going to be able to figure out. You look at Chinese dissidents, and they actually use that social steganography in order to encode messages within their own communications. And so there's this huge subversive movement in China against the government in places that the government just doesn't understand what's going on. And that's because privacy isn't just related, and a lot of these issues aren't just related to technical aspects. There's this, there's this very innovative human ingenuity that's involved in it at all levels. So for that, I'm very, very optimistic. And I really hope that other people are optimistic too. There's a lot of positive going on, and I think unfortunately we hear a lot about the bad, but there is so much good going on. There's so many good things about the internet that I think generally we should be optimistic about its future.
Great. Thank you so much, Will, and all of our participants this evening. We apologize if we couldn't get to your question, but we encourage you to continue the discussion with other participants in the chat room or on the Facebook event. I hope you all can continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Wednesday, March 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Chris Coyne on the ability to protect, the limits of state-led humanitarian action. To register for this webinar, please visit studentsforliberty.org. On a final note, shortly you will receive a follow-up email where you will find more detailed information about SFL and our next webinar. You'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve our program to make the webinars more interesting for you. And with that, I think we are officially wrapped up. Thank you again for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night, everyone.